food that's highly rewarding is food that the brain thinks is amazing, right? Like by definition, there's some part of your brain that's like, this is awesome. And when a part of your brain thinks the food that you're eating is awesome, it's going to want to get more of it, right? There's a part of the brain, and it's primarily located in the hypothalamus. I call it the lipostat. Lipo means fat, and stat means the same. So that just means that's the part of the brain that's regulating body fatness, calorie intake, our appetite, how much food we want to eat. And primarily what this system does is it responds to weight loss. We know that losing weight permanently is challenging. We know that a lot of people will lose weight and then regain over time. And this system is an important reason why. When your body fat starts to drop, your brain senses that via a decline in the hormone leptin. And then it turns on these systems like appetite, like reducing your energy expenditure, that work to bring the fat back. We know some people who have an easy time maintaining their weight. They don't seem to care about their weight. They eat whatever they want, whenever they want. They don't exercise that much, and they don't seem to gain weight. And then we know other people who care a lot and who are really trying and who are gaining weight anyway, or who have a hard time losing. So genetics is part of the reason for that. 40 to 80% of differences in body fatness between individuals are explained by genetics. If we're stressed, many people will go toward calorie-dense comfort foods in order to feel better, because that's actually one of the most effective tools we have in everyday life to feel better. And so the opposite of that is having food that is
Hey there, welcome to the Happy Habit Podcast. I'm Matthew. I'm here every week talking health and well-being. So if those are subjects that are of interest to you, well then you're in the right place. And if you're already familiar with this podcast, having consumed maybe 110 or even 100 episodes to date and would like to show your support, well then please like, subscribe and share with other people who you think might get some education and some enjoyment from these episodes too. Plus, if you're on YouTube, you can check us out over there, and we're aiming for 3,000 subscribers in the coming week. I noticed the vast majority of people who are consuming these episodes on YouTube haven't quite subscribed to date. So please like, subscribe, and tell other people all about the YouTube channel. Now, today I speak with the author of The Hungry Brain, Dr. Stephan Guyenet. We find out that weight loss isn't a simple case of willpower, but that we are in fact slaves to our ancient brains. We hear about the part of the brain that wants us to retain our body weight and by extension our body fat for health and fertility reasons. The good news is we can influence this part of the brain through our diet and behaviour. We hear about how the brain views some foods as rewards and about high-value foods, plus we discover what proportion of our weight gain is dictated by our genes. This is a really interesting conversation and I hope you enjoy. You're the author of The Hungry Brain, in which you state that nobody wants to overeat and become obese and to suffer from all of the chronic diseases that come with being overweight. And it's not a case of a lack of willpower. Instead, you say we are victims of our ancient brains.
The brain and the body evolved to address the challenges of a specific environment or a specific set of environments. And we have all these systems in our brains and bodies that kind of run things. And one of those systems is this kind of conscious, rational brain that we have that makes us the humans that we are. But along with that, we have all of these other non-conscious or minimally conscious systems that run kind of basic housekeeping functions. And among those housekeeping functions are things like regulating the energy content of your body, like the amount of fat that you have on your body, and things related to that, like your hunger, your craving, your satiety at a meal, how full you feel after, however many bites you've taken at your meal. And those are all things that are, again, regulated by non-conscious or minimally conscious parts of your brain. So you don't decide that you want to be hungry. You don't decide when you smell freshly baked cookies that you want to start craving them. Those are things that arise in your mind as a result of processing that's occurring of internal and external cues in these very deeply wired, evolutionarily calibrated non-conscious brain regions. And those brain regions that are determining our hunger and our cravings and to a large extent our eating behavior, they evolved in a very different context than how we live today. And so the problem is that the context we live in today tends to push the buttons on those systems, right? It pushes those buttons a little bit too much. It gives us too many opportunities to feel those motivations like the hungers and craving things. And that's the basic problem that I outlined in my book.
Lipostat is a term I never came across until I read this book, and it's massively significant in the context of our health and our fertility. Can you explain what its role is?
Yeah, absolutely. So we still have a fair amount to learn about it. So, there's a fair amount of uncertainty, but we do know that there is a system in the brain that regulates body fatness. And this was first discovered 100 years ago when scientists started doing little brain lesions in animals. And what they found was that there are specific parts of the brain, particularly a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, where if you put lesions, in other words, where you take out certain very small parts of the brain, you could either create extreme obesity or you could create leanness, depending on where you lesioned. And so, yeah, there's a part of the brain, and it's primarily located in the hypothalamus. I call it the lipostat. Lipo means fat, and stat means the same. So that just means that's the part of the brain that's regulating body fatness. And it does that primarily by regulating our calorie intake, our appetite, how much food we want to eat, and how that responds to different environmental conditions. But it also affects our energy expenditure. So if you're trying to lose weight, for example, or if you have lost weight, this system can cut down your calorie expenditure in order to conserve energy and try to get some of that weight back. And primarily what this system does is it responds to weight loss. We know that losing weight permanently is challenging. We know that a lot of people will lose weight and then regain over time. And this system is an important reason why, because it's a regulatory system. You can think of it a little bit like a thermostat in your house, where if you have your thermostat set at a certain temperature and the temperature goes below that, there are systems that are going to turn on the heat, right, to try to bring that temperature back up. So that's the way this works too. When your body fat starts to drop, your brain senses that via a decline in the hormone leptin, and then it turns on these systems like appetite, like reducing your energy expenditure, that work to bring the fat back. And there may be other mechanisms too, but basically it's this coordinated behavioral and physiological system that gets activated to bring energy back into your body, put it back in your fat stores, and bring back what you had lost.
And here's this sting in the tail for anyone who's trying to lose weight, that it's because of lipostat that the more weight we lose, the hungrier we get, which in one respect seems really cruel if you're trying to lose weight. But it makes sense, I suppose, from a health and a fertility standpoint.
I mean, certainly it's the case that this system is working harder the more weight you lose. Yeah. And that expresses itself both in appetite and in reductions in your body's metabolic rate.
Where do our genes come into the equation? Because they make up a big contribution of how much someone will weigh.
Yeah, it is very important. I mean, and I think we recognize intuitively that we know some people who have an easy time maintaining their weight. They don't seem to care about their weight. They eat whatever they want, whenever they want. They don't exercise that much, and they don't seem to gain weight. And then we know other people who care a lot and who are really trying and who are gaining weight anyway, or who have a hard time losing. So I think intuitively, it's not hard to understand that genetics is part of the reason for that. And that's what the studies show as well. Depending on what kind of study you focus on, it can be anywhere from 40 to 80% of differences in body fatness between individuals are explained by genetics. So if you look in a population of 100 people, you have people of every different weight. Those differences between people are explained something like 40 to 80% by genetics. So pretty much any way you slice it, it's a big deal. Yeah.
Can we talk about high-calorie foods and how the brain views these foods as a reward, and how this then dictates our consumption of these very foods?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to give a little bit of the evolutionary context here. So food is obviously very, very important for the survival and reproduction of organisms, right? And so we evolved with brains that are very food-oriented. And one of the things that is the most important about food from a survival and reproduction standpoint is the energy it contains. Because energy, right, that's what lets you move around in your environment. That's what lets you heat your body. That's what lets you build a child in the uterus, take care of a child through lactation, etc. So energy is really critical. And it appears that energy is really the main thing that the brain is kind of looking for implicitly out of food. So we have, and energy is kind of an abstract concept, right? What that refers to is the energy that's in certain kind of chemicals in our food, right? And we're talking about carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Those are the macronutrients that supply energy in our diet. And so, it's not just energy floating around in the air, it's specific chemicals that the brain is looking for and that the body is looking for you to consume. And so the way that works is our brains and our bodies are hardwired to recognize these energy-dense chemicals in food, the carbs, the fat, the protein, and motivate you toward food that contains those things. And so the body has receptors in your digestive tract that detect those compounds, and then those cause dopamine release in your brain, and that causes a motivational response. And so when you eat a food that's really high in, let's say, fat and carbohydrate, for example, those are the two especially important nutrients for delivering energy. When your body detects that you ate a food with lots of those, you're going to get a lot of dopamine response, especially if there's carbs and fat together, which is especially nice for the brain. And then you're going to get a motivational response, and your brain's going to say, I really like this. You need to be motivated by this. And again, you're not in control of this. This is something that just bubbles up from non-conscious processing in your mind. So you eat that slice of pizza or whatever it is, you experience an emotional or a motivational response to eat a lot of it, or let's say you smell it, you experience a motivational response to acquire it. Let's say you're walking by the shop, your brain's like, yeah, let's get some of that. You're willing to go in, you're willing to pay for it, and then you're going to eat it. So you experience, and you would want to have that over something like, a handful of celery sticks, right? Like if you have pizza in front of you and you have celery sticks in front of you, most people are going to choose the pizza, not the celery sticks, because that is where the motivational response is happening, because that's where all the calories are. That's where all the starch and fat and protein is. That's triggering your brain's motivational response. So we have these deeply hardwired responses to calorie-containing nutrients that motivate us to eat those foods. And that was good for our ancestors, right? I mean, that's exactly what they needed to get the energy they needed to survive in a really difficult, rugged environment. The problem is that today it's just really easy for us to get that. And so we have those same strong motivations that our ancestors had, because our brains, this is hardwired stuff. This is mostly not learned behaviors. This is hardwired stuff that we inherited. We still have those really strong motivations to get that energy, but we have more motivation than we need in this environment where energy is so easy to get.
It's fascinating to think that the choices we make, and I use choices in inverted commas, about food aren't actually our conscious choices at all. They're being dictated by other biochemical processes and other multi-sensory interactions deep within us, really, as you say, with origins in our ancestry over hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it may be uncomfortable for some people to contemplate, but the more you contemplate it, the more you realize that a lot of our behavior and our thinking is coming from non-conscious parts of the brain. But it's hard to see because it's not unconscious, right? And so it's below what we're aware of. And so we don't really recognize how much our behavior and our thought patterns are influenced by non-conscious brain processes. But certainly, I don't think you could argue that that's not true for eating behavior. I think eating behavior, you can decide whether or not to eat the pizza, right? So like if I had something delicious in front of me and somebody put a gun to my head and said, don't eat it, I wouldn't eat it. So you can do that. But those non-conscious processes are nevertheless very persuasive and influential over long periods of time. Like, let's say you take the gun away and now I'm just using willpower because I don't think it's healthy. and I have it in front of my plate every day at lunch, there's the pizza sitting there and I'm trying not to eat it. Like, how long am I going to last? Probably not forever, right? So these non-conscious brain regions, they're not forcing us to do anything, but they're very persuasive. And so they can certainly guide our behavior to quite a strong extent, especially if we're just running on habit, which most people do.
And then to add another element to the equation, that of a food's value. So we already know about a food that is high in calories being highly rewarding. But if that food is easy to get, its value seems to rocket still further.
And you know what? I think to an extent, what you said is exactly true as well, is that the thing that triggers those motivations, those reward drives, is exposure to cues. And so if you have, if your brain, we'll go back to the pizza example. So you've eaten pizza a few times, your brain knows that it has all this energy, you've gotten that dopamine response. What'll happen is that dopamine response will transfer onto the cues that predict the pizza. And so next time it'll be the smell of the pizza that triggers the craving. So instead of, taking some bites and then feeling like you want to eat a lot of pizza, it'll be like you smell it or you see it, or you're in the situation where you had it last time, you're with the people you had it with last time. That's going to trigger the motivation. So exposure to those sensory cues, like the smells and the sights of highly rewarding, highly motivating food, those things are the triggers that will trigger those behaviors. And this is really basic stuff. It's not just food. This is the same thing, someone who smokes cigarettes is trying to quit. They are going to have their motivation triggered by smelling cigarette smoke, by seeing someone smoke, by walking by the shop where they usually smoke cigarettes. And if you're trying to stop smoking, those are the cues. This is one of the key things you need to do, is limit those sensory cues that get your dopamine spiking about cigarettes, right? And so it's food is not the same as drugs, but that's just an illustration of the general principle of how reward works. Once it's stamped into your brain, it's those sensory cues, the sight, the smell, the situation, etc., that triggers your motivational drive. So coming back to what you said, having something in your direct environment, that's certainly going to be giving you cues. So the sight, the smell, etc., that are going to be driving your motivation. But in addition, there's very little effort bar, right? Like if all you have to do is reach across the table to get that piece of food, then you're a lot more likely to do it than if you had to walk 5 miles and climb a tree to get the same food, right? Which is like what our ancestors had to do.
Stress is deemed by the body to be a threat, which will also influence how much we eat.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it's kind of interesting because people go in two different directions. There's a lot of variability. Some people, when they get stressed out, they will eat more, and some people will eat less. Some people, it'll cut their appetite and they won't want to eat. Other people will really move toward food. So it seems to be fairly individual and probably depends somewhat on the type of stress as well. But I think either way, whether you're eating more or eating less, it's probably not so good for you, even if you're eating less and losing weight. And yeah, there seems to be two mechanisms that I'm familiar with that could be behind that. One of them is that stress can increase the level of the hormone called cortisol, and that can alter how these appetite and body fat regulation pathways work in the brain and potentially contribute to fat gain, particularly in the abdominal region. And the other one is that we simply use food to comfort ourselves. If we're stressed, many people will go toward calorie-dense comfort foods in order to feel better, because that's actually one of the most effective tools we have in everyday life to feel better. Like it's not, there are other things you can do, but food is, for a lot of people, just kind of like the easiest, most straightforward thing to make themselves feel better. People often will kind of default to that in order to feel better. And it does dampen those stress response pathways in the brain. Like I guess that's probably obvious because we feel better. So the stress response pathways are obviously dampened, but in neuroscience, they've observed that directly, that you can see that the activity of certain pathways in the amygdala related to stress are dampened by things like food. Not just food, but highly palatable kind of comfort food. But it's not the only thing that does it. You can do it with other things too, right? Like in the research, they've shown that sex does something similar. And then you could imagine that like going for a walk, calling a friend, working in the garden, things like that could have a similar effect.
Well, let's look at weight loss solutions and revisit the lipostat, which you spoke about earlier. This is the part of the hypothalamus in the brain, which helps regulate our fat levels through appetite, behavior, and metabolism. Is it possible to influence the lipostat such that you can drop fat levels and get rid of any excess fat?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the lipostat has, by some people, has been conceptualized as this kind of rigid thing that it's like a home thermostat and it can't change. And I think that's clearly not the case at all. I think the evidence is pretty clear that it can go upwards. Man, that happens to many of us as we age, right? We put on body fat and that seems to be like our body's new comfortable weight that our body is kind of defending. But I do think it can go down as well. I think it's more difficult to make it go down than it is to make it go up. But I do think there are some things we can do. There are dietary interventions, particularly where you put people on a particular diet and their calorie intake goes down without asking them to eat fewer calories. You just put them on a particular diet, they eat fewer calories, they lose weight, they don't seem to be getting excessively hungry. So, I think probably the most studied version of this is a low carb diet. You can put someone on a low carb diet. Most people will drop their calorie intake spontaneously by several hundred calories a day just because they're not as interested in eating food. They just don't have the same kind of appetite anymore. And they'll lose weight and they kind of, achieve a new plateau at a lower weight as long as they're sticking with the diet. I do want to acknowledge that if you look at the studies with pretty much any diet, including low carb diet, people do often tend to regain over time. And I think we're not quite sure how much of that has to do with people just not sticking with the diet as well over time versus some other kind of adaptation that's happening in the body. There are a couple of things to think about in this regard. I think one, probably the biggest lever we have here to lower the lipostat is diet quality. I think that's consistent with the fact that diets are the most effective behavioral weight loss method we have. The single most effective, I should say. So things like increasing the satiety value of your diet, I think is a good start. Things like reducing the reward value of the diet. So you're not stimulating the brain so much and telling it, when you're eating food that's highly rewarding, your food that's highly rewarding is food that the brain thinks is amazing, right? Like by definition, there's some part of your brain that's like, this is awesome. And when a part of your brain thinks the food that you're eating is awesome, it's going to want to get more of it, right? Like this is a really basic conclusion. The way I think about it is it kind of starts taking the brakes off some of the other systems. This is a highly desirable food, so we're going to let you eat more. We're going to require more food for you to feel full. And over time, we're going to let your lipostat go up a little bit to accommodate this amazing food that you're getting all the time. And so the opposite of that is having food that is lower reward food. So food that's less calorie dense, that's simpler, that's higher in protein and doesn't have as much of these combinations of fat and carbs in the same food that really seem to push our buttons. And then another thing I think can be helpful for some people is physical activity. It's kind of interesting is that the biggest value of physical activity seems to be after you've lost weight and maintaining it. It seems to really help your body remain comfortable at that lower weight. And so that's part of the evidence for why it may be affecting that lipostat.
Well, the book again, it's called The Hungry Brain. Dr. Guyenet, if people want to find out more about you and seek you out online, where can they go?
So I have a website, stephanguyenet.com or .org. And also my Twitter handle is sguyenet, and that's probably where I am most active. Yeah.
Well, it's a very informative read. Lots of citations in there as well for people who are looking for the science. But thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate your thoughts, Dr. Stephan Guyenet.
Thank you, Matthew.
Well, thank you for tuning into this episode of the Happy Habit Podcast. If you liked it, if you enjoyed it whatsoever, please like, subscribe, and share with other people who you think might enjoy it too. You can also check us out on YouTube. Click the like button, subscribe, and share there too. Until next time, stay happy.